Welcome everyone. We're here at the Ohio Arts Council's Wright Gallery, and we'll be listening to artist David La Palomara, who will be taking us on the journey of how his work has evolved over time. Within this exhibition, he has explored landscape, but I think that he's going to share a lot more with us than that. He's also a full-time professor down at OU in Athens, Ohio, and so I don't spoil your presentation, I'm going to hand it over to you. Without further ado, welcome David.
So, welcome everybody here and online, and I guess without scaring anyone away, I'm going to tell my life story, but don't worry, it won't last more than a lot of time. But actually, I thought that it might be helpful to kind of explain to folks in relationship to the work in this show, how did I get here? What led me to my current landscape paintings? And so you'll see in this first slide, it all began in Italy, and then it returned to Italy, and in between and currently, it always comes back to Ohio, which is kind of strange, maybe. What you see is a 7-year-old, which was the first time, well, that was my second full year in Italy. I didn't remember the first year. I was 3 months old, so a year and 3 months, but we went back to my first grade year. And I think that what you see as a 7-year-old can have a huge influence on what you might do later in life. And even though this is kind of obviously Michelangelo, and that's my face as a 7-year-old, superimposed over Michelangelo's sculpture. But in all seriousness, my parents dragged me to every museum and every site, archaeological site over that year, and wondered sometimes while my dad especially would stand in front of artworks for what seemed like forever, but I think I was absorbing a lot of stuff. For example, this is, and this will all make sense when I get to the end, a ceiling perspective painting in Rome, the Church of St. Ignatius, painted by Andrea Pozzo, and it's a perspective alignment. So when you're in the church, when you're seated in the pews and you look up, it's as if the vaulted ceiling of the church is actually not there. And obviously in this, figures are ascending to heaven, but it's an illusion. But you have to stand, you can't walk this way or that way. All of the sort of perspective alignments sort of don't work, and it starts to look crazy. The most dramatic perspective alignment in this church is the dome, which I guess when they thought they were close to finishing the church, they didn't have enough money to actually build the dome, and it sat and sat and sat and sat, and then finally they thought maybe the same artist can paint the illusion of the dome on a round canvas that we will simply attach to the flat underneath of what would be the dome. When you're sitting in the church, it absolutely looks like a dome. It's not. If there's not a service going on, you can walk up underneath the altar, you'll look up, and the perspective is crazy. It doesn't make any sense at all. But this view, and you would swear that it was a dome, so it's a highly photorealistic painting. Some of the other things that I saw in Italy, and I guess the point of showing you some of these things is, well, it'll become apparent in a minute. So this is the Piazza San Pietro colonnade. The colonnade and the facade of St. Peter's were designed by Bernini, who was a sculptor, but he was also an architect. And this colonnade is kind of fascinating. I mean, so that the plaza of St. Peter's is an ellipse. And I'll show you a slide in a minute. So a circle has one point in the center that's the focal point. An ellipse has two focal points, sort of set in from the sides, set off from the center. Anyway, when you look at this colonnade, you can see that it's 3 columns deep. And when you're in the plaza, it looks like a forest of columns. And you move around, and it's a forest of columns. There are 2 bronze plaques at the center of either ellipse on either side. That if you go stand on that bronze plaque and look at the ellipse, and those colonnades, or those bronze plaques are, right about here, if you can see the cursor, right about here in front of the fountain looking Bernini obviously knew what he was doing. He put the plaques in the cobblestones of the plaza so that he could engage his viewers in this sort of trip, so to speak. But he was interested in kind of this back and forth dialogue, visual dialogue between his architecture that he was making and the viewers that were coming to see it. But he also did something also really fascinating. So when they were trying to figure out how to finish the plaza, I can get my hair over here. The facade of the building, actually the bottom of the building is right here. Where's my hair? There it is. And I guess the architects and the artists thought that this sort of skinny and elongated facade was disproportionate and needed to be corrected. And so he came up with an ingenious solution. He kind of excavated the floor of the plaza itself and built a staircase. It's right here, and I'll show you the next slide. I mean, so here's the staircase that I just pointed out, and here's a really long ramp up to the facade itself. But when you're in the plaza and looking at it, it just looks like an extension of the facade itself. And so he was able to add some dimensionality to what his contemporaries thought was just too long and narrow, and so he fixed it. So that was something that I remember seeing as a kid. And one final. So this is a mural painting in the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii. My parents brought me to Pompeii as a kid. I saw this painting when I was a kid. I don't remember if I was, consciously thinking, but certainly, as I'll explain in a minute, one of the things that intrigues me now about this painting is this winged figure has got a whip in her hand and is getting ready to, put a lashing on this cowering figure over here, but the whip is going to have to travel through real space. It's going to have to leave the wall, travel through real space, re-enter the painting on the other opposing wall in order for this to happen. So when I went to college in Ohio, remember I told you to come back to Ohio, at Oberlin, I started making sculptures. This is just one piece, and I was photographing this piece, and something really strange happened when I took this shot. It's not a great, this is actually a digital copy of a 35mm slide, but you might sort of see that sort of 90-degree angle of that one, triangle, it flattened out. The light was adjusted just perfectly from one side to the other side, and there was no edge. And I got really excited because I was really interested in sculpture, but I thought, maybe I can actually explore not virtual sculpture, but the idea of sculpture in some other less sculpture traditional or specific modes. So I started a series of perspective alignment installations in the woods that are in some ways, so this is where, and my teacher was saying, my gosh, your work is a lot like what Italian Renaissance and Baroque painters and sculptors and architects were doing. And so I hadn't really necessarily made the connection before then, but here I was making these things. And so this piece is, and I'll explain it so you understand what it is, a piece of plate glass that's about 5 inches by 4 feet, 1/4 inch thick. I attached it to these 3 trees in the foreground and then painted red acrylic paint over it, except for where it looks like those trees in the background are sitting in front of it. So it should look sort of impossible. And part of the idea of this work was to sort of create a conflict between what reality might look like and what reality really can't do, and have this sort of be a back and forth. And in the process of sort of negotiating the 2D and the 3D of this image, or in the woods if you were there, there is, again, a heightened sense or appreciation of ideas that are to do with sculpture. So here's another piece that was simply a dotted line on trees at varying depths, but if the width and the distance and the height on each tree were adjusted just right, it would be the illusion of a 2-dimensional dotted line space. And so, is it flat? Is it 3D? Is it flat? Is it 3D? And so that back and forth is a way to kind of again, hopefully help the viewer understand and appreciate the process of sort of perceiving and experiencing space rather than just kind of negotiating and meandering through our everyday. Here's another similar piece that I can, different piece that I can just sort of illustrate. If I remember correctly, this little white stripe here was probably about 5 inches. And this tree back here that has got from the top to the bottom was, or this one way back here, was probably about 14 feet. So again, it's a perspective, alignment, adjustment, and make various disparate parts look flat in a three-dimensional space. When I was photographing these, I wished I had done what I did with this piece was show the process of sort of, oh, and I should say too that all of these perspective alignments actually existed in the woods. They were up. The first pieces were made with lime fertilizer mixed with water. I applied it to the trees. They would stay up on the trees as long as or until it rained, and then it would wash off. In the winter, it doesn't necessarily rain, so I started wrapping trees with fabric so that I could leave it out for a day or two and then take it down. But anyway, so this piece is and they were all designed to be seen along footpaths through the woods, so you wouldn't necessarily have to, I mean, there's a certain contrivance about having an X marks the spot or an X marks the spot along a trail where these things might work. But this would give you an idea if you were walking on a footpath, what would happen as you kind of got to that point, and suddenly there's this circle that kind of pierces the three-dimensional flat circle, but it's, again, comprising trees at various different depths. So I had an art history professor in college that taught Italian and Baroque art, Italian Renaissance and Baroque art, and he said, you need to go to Italy and look at, you saw these things when you were a kid, but you need to go back and study all of the perspective, alignment, paintings, and sculptures and architecture. He said you should apply for a Fulbright and you should apply for a Rhodes Prize Fellowship after grad school. So I went to grad school and continued to kind of study this idea. And so this is a piece that is a series of photographs of a figure that gets smaller and smaller. And I've had people look at this and swear that I'm moving away from the figure. That the camera, the viewer, the camera was perched on top of a hill, and kind of like the Bernini piece where you couldn't really see the ramp, if you kind of get your eye level at just the right height, instead of, and on a flat plane, if the figure is moving away from you in space, their feet are going to get higher and higher and higher in the picture plane. This whole idea in Western art that up is back, up is further away. This is just the opposite. The figure is moving downhill, and the head gets lower and lower. So it's just the reverse. So it's, again, this sort of trying to create this point of conflict between what you might expect to see and what's actually happening. So, and I ended up going to Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, Nova Scotia, after college, still thinking about Italy, but realizing I, be helpful to get a graduate degree. And I kept playing with this idea. And so this was, I think I have a couple, 2 or 3 images in this series of red knife poses on a shiny knife. And then trying to line up the reflection of my thumb with my actual forefinger, but not to do it in a perfectly sort of illusionistic way. To leave enough of a sort of a disconnection or an anomaly. You see here that the reflection of this finger sort of kind of goes up the knife, but that fingernail there is my thumbnail. It's not my forefingernail, and so hopefully there's enough information in these photographs that a viewer can kind of step back and say, well, wait a minute, I know how that works, and so I did this series. This one's almost, I look at this film, I almost get sort of double vision, there's my real finger behind the knife, and the thumb reflection that sort of lines up with my, anyway.
David, can you speak up?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And I also started a series of pieces that were wall floor connecting or wall connecting installations. And so this is a piece where I literally just painted a black triangle on the wall, painted a black triangle on the floor. And from one angle, these two black triangles can kind of align so that it looks like one flat black triangle, even though you can see the space of the wall and the floor, but it's a two-dimensional shape. This same piece, if you move around it, becomes more of a square. Same piece, if you keep moving around it, gets inverted and maybe looks like an arrow, or just in some kind of weird inverted trapezoidal shape. And one more piece from grad school that's sort of important, and I'm leaving out a lot of work in between, but this was an installation where I took an interior architectural space and simply observed where the highlights and the shadows were being cast on the wall, and then mixed yellow, very light yellow, and very light brown, and very light blue acrylic paint, and simply painted back over the highlights and the shadows so that they were just slightly pigment enhanced, so that when you would look at it, you would see, well, wait a minute, that's more color than the light is projecting. It's pigment, but it's also really light. So both things were happening simultaneously. So I ended up winning the lottery, and I got both a Fulbright and the Rome Prize Fellowship, which allowed me to extend what was originally going to be a one-year Italy stay to 3 years. And I'm just going to include just a couple of pieces from that period that are sort of instructive of the work that I'm still doing today. I've done a lot of installations on actual walls, wall corners, and wall floor corners. You can kind of think of it as a horizontal corner. But of course, anytime I moved studios or moved locations, I had to leave my work behind. So I kind of hit on the idea of creating my own portable corners by creating, these were 8 by 8 foot panels, screwed together at a right angle, and suddenly I've got a movable corner. And so part of the idea with these wall pieces was to, again, kind of create these paintings and sort of represent these pictorial spaces that somehow invaded or engaged the viewer, the actual viewer space. So that you could actually walk into the space of the painting, kind of like, a little bit maybe, the Pompeii painting, that corner mural. And also thinking about light and color, that this floating, is it a floating corner? Is it a floating box? Is it on the ground? It's obviously being illuminated from right to left. This chair, this sort of iconic chair, is sitting on a very pared down flat ground plane, but it's got a shadow. And so there's this pictorial describing of a space that is also hopefully sort of engaging the real space of the viewer. So again, it's hopefully this back and forth. I've sometimes given an analogy, that maybe describes kind of a little bit what I have tried to do and continue to try to do in my art in terms of creating these conflict points. If you've ever reached out to open a door and you missed the doorknob and you stumble backward, or you're walking down a flight of stairs in your basement and the lights aren't on, and you think you've got one more step and you think you're at the bottom step, and suddenly you trip, hopefully you don't hurt yourself, but suddenly it's like your conscious body comes into conflict with your habitualized body. There are a lot of, most things that we do in our everyday, I suppose, are just actions and negotiations through space that we don't have to kind of figure out how far away is the milk glass or the apple. You reach out and grab it, you know, it's there. I guess part of what I've tried to do in these works is to kind of upend those notions in a hopefully not too aggressive way, right? But then have the viewer, give the viewer the sort of option and choice to sort of see the back and forth between. This is another of my chair pieces. This was even bigger. Panels were 10 feet high by 8 feet wide. Again, screwed together in a right angle. With a floating chair on the one panel, maybe the shadow of that chair on the other panel. The shadow is one of those, I don't know if you've ever seen any of those perspective drawings where you kind of flip the box inside or outside, and if you stare at that little chair, you can think that this is the seat of the chair that you would sit flat on, or it's the underneath of the chair that you would be sitting on in the other direction. And around this time, I went back to Ohio, to Antioch College, where Rod Serling graduated years before I got there. But I was really excited about this because if you've ever watched The Twilight Zone, I guess the idea that you can occupy two spaces simultaneously was kind of like, that's what I'm doing in my art. Exactly what I'm doing in my art. So I always kind of thought that he was maybe one of my inspirations for all the years that I lived in Yellow Springs. And around this time too, I was in New Haven, Connecticut, and saw a big show that I think was traveling from the National Gallery. That was a show of painted screens. That, in a way, was exactly the kind of portable walls that I was making in my previous studios, but way, way, way more portable and way more functional. And so I started making painted landscapes on folding screens with the idea that they could indeed serve as furniture, they could serve as room dividers, but that they were also kind of, again, still sort of engaging these ideas of sort of 2D, 3D points of conflict and connection. The other nice thing about the folding screens, as opposed to my chair corners, is that they're double-sided. So they want to be set up not up against the wall, but more in the middle of the space. It then creates an interesting sort of physical negotiation around the piece. And I think with these screens, I've also always sort of thought of them as almost like if you sort of imagine or agree that what you're looking at is a landscape, it's almost as if you disregard the architecture of the object itself, the folded plane, the folding screen. It's almost like you're looking through it and seeing the landscape. And so again, it's a little bit more subtle than maybe some of my earlier installations in the woods, but hopefully still kind of engaging in that sense. I think some of these pieces I have here these are large screens, 6 feet high by 8 feet if you would unfold them all together. Some of them are in the show. I think I maybe have a couple here that I think this one is in the show. And I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly just to give an idea. Most of these screens, I mean, I guess I've also, one of the reasons that I went to graduate school in Nova Scotia was I wanted to be in the middle of wilderness. And you can get in your car to live in Halifax and drive 20 minutes in either direction. And it is absolute the middle of nowhere wilderness, which has been the subject and inspiration in a lot of my work, if not all of it, certainly much of it, or most of it. And I've been going, these are Maine, Acadia National Park, where I've been going since I was 8. And it's a place, sometimes I look at my landscape paintings and think, well, are these places I would rather be? Not that I don't like Ohio, I love Ohio. But there are a lot of places that I miss when I'm not there, and so this is also a way to kind of have that connection when I'm not there. And so that's an important sort of inspiration, sort of ongoing influence in my art. And it's funny because, you know, I trained as a sculptor. I took one painting class in college. I'm otherwise a completely self-taught painter, but once you learn how to learn, you can kind of navigate yourself through the process of obviously looking at a lot of other art, knowing and talking to lots of other artists. These days, just about anything you might want to learn, you can probably find DIY on the internet and figure it out. But certainly, one of the reasons I'm still painting landscapes, painting just in general, is that I don't think I've learned everything that I want to learn. So I think that's an important consideration. When I did this piece, I'm not sure if I'd ever painted rocks before. It's like, how do you paint rocks? What should you do to make water look like water? This is one big screen from another series of Italy works that I didn't have time to show you today. It's a little bit more abstracted, but still sort of utilizing. And I think one of the things in the screen that always interests me, looking at from this show I saw, is how you can kind of, use receding pathways. You can incorporate sort of perspective schemes and compositional schemes in a painting that will kind of pull you deeper into the space, and if you can do things that might kind of push and pull in relationship to the actual folded image itself. This is not me, that's Utah. Did a whole series of, one of the other nice things about being a landscape artist, landscape painter, is it's the perfect excuse to see new places and maybe find art inspirations in lots of other different kinds of spaces. I also have done, this is just a couple of examples of smaller tabletop screens. This is an example of a screen that's 12 inches high by 20 inches long. And honestly, even a screen that size can have some functional value. I had somebody ask me to do a commission once for a piece just a little bigger than that so that they could hide their TV in their living room shelf when they were having guests over and they didn't want to have a big ugly TV sitting there. So, boom, put a screen up and suddenly the TV's gone. It's still there, but you can't really see it. And I guess that leads me to where I currently live, which is Athens, Ohio, which is kind of an expansive. There are some hills, obviously, in Athens, but Ohio generally is sort of, it stretches out a little bit more than a lot of places I live. And so I think that that's probably also one of the reasons why I got into landscape painting, panorama landscape painting, which again is still so the thread still connects, I think, to what I was doing all the way back, or at least looking at when I was 7 years old, living in Italy, and then in college, and then grad school, and then on my fellowships in Italy. These panoramas should look realistic, but they should also have just a little bit of a spatial distortion, and we don't really see that. Someone described it once that, when we're in a space, that we don't see in panorama, we kind of move our head, and it's a series of sort of still snapshots that we kind of obviously piece together in our brain. But the idea that you're presented with an elongated, stretched out panorama is almost by its very nature sort of distortion. So these are just some additional, it's interesting. So the show that was curated, I'm pretty sure that all the panoramas that got selected for this are from upstate Pennsylvania, which is another place that I visited, and interesting mountainscapes and snowscapes and visited views. But this is still back in Maine. If you've used the panorama feature on your camera, sometimes you'll realize that it kind of does some weird things. It can kind of bulge the image out in the center. If you're on a pathway, I don't know if I've got an image of the pathway, but you'll see the halfway on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of your panorama photograph, but it's weird, it's distorted. So these are some of the still sort of trying to negotiate this 2D, 3D conversation that I've been having in my art for quite a long time. And so just a few last, and I think that, you know, one of the other things that's been happening is that obviously as I was initially sort of doing my corner installations and dealing with paint for the first time and dealing with pigment and light and color and thinking about those as additional ways that you can create illusions to kind of negotiate a pictorial representation of reality next to the actual physical reality itself is, again, I think I've become certainly more interested in painting and the painterliness of my art, which is also interesting and honestly rewarding for me. Let me just show you the last few of these. And some of these are very recent. This was a painting from this past summer. And the last three are, again, maybe another place I would like to be. Been visiting Puerto Rico for the last several years, and I've started living in seascapes, which again, I've never painted sand, I've never painted really, at least turquoise ocean. So this has been kind of a fun additional new subject to include in my art. And as I have gotten more and more interested in color, in atmosphere, in light, I don't know, maybe, maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to chop my ear off, I promise. But Van Gogh was certainly a colorist. So, thanks very much.
Do you want to take a look?
Sure.
Yeah. We're going to walk over and look at David's pieces in the show. You want to go ahead?
Sure. We can start here, yeah? Oh, yeah, maybe we can go around the corner.
So,
Sure.
just
Okay, so as I said, these four paintings, and I think the three around the corner, are all Pennsylvania. I was actually kind of happy that the student curator chose maybe a less of a variety, but more of a sort of focused study of this particular kind of landscape. These four, at least, are after a 3-hour hike to the top of a mountain and snow. And as I said a minute ago, when I first started painting rocky Acadia National Park seascapes, and maybe I needed to teach myself how to paint rocks. Before these paintings, I really had to paint snow. And when you're painting snow, it's not just white. It's lots of shades of white, pink white, blue white, and shadows, very subtle shadows can be really important in terms of kind of creating that space. I think one of the things I like about these snowy scene landscape paintings is how sort of pared down and simple they are. As long as you can get the stuff in the right place, there's not a lot of different kind of painted elements. That you gotta choose the right colors, the right tones, the perspective of how you're composing it has to also work. And again, hopefully they look realistic, but if you were there, you would see, there's these sort of stretching stretching out of the landscape and sort of distorting of the landscape. It is, I think, the product of this sort of panorama has formed that. And I know around the corner, maybe we can hop around the corner. And so actually, well, the top and the bottom of these two paintings are just a perfect example. I was literally, when I was, and I do take a lot of photographs as source material, and in fact, the panorama feature on a smartphone or iPhone, that path on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of that painting is a straight path that I was standing on, but when you kind of look at it from the left and scan your head or scan your phone to the right, you get this really strange distortion of that space. And so, again, maybe a viewer might think, well, those are two different paths, and so that could make sense. And in fact, I mean, there isn't anything not believable about these landscape panoramas. But, same on the top, I mean, that's more of a casual path through the woods, a walking path, versus maybe an old logging trail on the one on the bottom. And so those are the same kind of 2D, 3D kind of conflicts and collisions in a much subtler way, I think, than a lot of my earlier pieces, but hopefully interesting and hopefully intriguing and hopefully fun to look at as well. And I guess behind me are some of my taller screens that, again, you know, obviously these require a certain amount of distance to kind of step back to, if you're too close, sometimes it doesn't exactly work, but, and so I'm still doing the screens as well as the panoramas. If anybody has any questions.
I do. I was curious about the fact that, you know, you're focusing often on similar vistas, and it seems as if you're not only documenting manipulation of space, but manipulation of time or apparent time. So could you talk a little bit about that? And then secondarily, second question is, this is natural expressions, the exhibition being based around nature. Can you more overtly tie in your concepts there?
Sure. So time. Maybe you mean, so a sculpture, you know, Ed Reinhardt, the artist, had a great saying that sculpture is what you bump into when you're backing up to look at a painting. And so I hope that my paintings, at least the screens, maybe the screens for sure to a larger extent, but that I've always kind of thought of them as instructed by my interest in sculpture, ideas, concepts, space, and a screen has to be negotiated. You have to, if that's what you mean about time, is that there is there has to be a physical interaction with the object itself in order to kind of understand what's happening in the piece. By time, do you mean era as well?
Open to interpretation.
Open to interpretation. So most of the landscapes that I've painted a few landscapes with figures in it, but otherwise they're always void of people. I certainly, for the sort of history of landscape painting, I've done a majority or a significant number of my paintings in Acadia National Park. You should definitely, if you haven't seen Ken Burns' The History of national parks. I mean, there are some really interesting sort of historical narratives and references that are at work. And then your second question had to do with
The theme.
the theme, natural expressions. This is the thing that maybe some landscape artists or painters maybe try to avoid a little bit. So this will sound corny, but I'll say it anyway. I guess the woods, nature is my church. And it's where I sort of feel a connection to things that are infinitely small and infinitely large, that are not quite knowable in their entirety, but maybe knowable to a certain extent also. I consider myself, I wouldn't necessarily say that my artworks are overtly political, but I consider myself an environmentalist, and so, you know, frequenting areas, memorializing nature in my art is a way to kind of celebrate an experience in the world that is diminishing to a certain extent. I mean, it's a long conversation, right? I mean, certainly my ability to travel and see spaces and paint spaces is a product of my privilege of having grown up with certain resources and opportunities to travel places and to see things. So, I mean, there's a lot, there are a lot of sort of facets and corners to kind of negotiate in terms of the subject itself. I mean, I'm really, you know, the show is really, this is a fascinating show, just because there are so many different sort of takes on the theme itself. I mean, yes, I'm in the show, so some kind of weird to say it's one of the more interesting group shows, but taking my work out of it is still like, I'm sorry that some of the artists actually weren't here at the opening, but I really wanted to talk to you about their art as well, to find out what their thinking was. So I was really grateful and happy to be invited for the show, and also really happy to work with a student curator, a high school student curator, who, I mean, what a wonderful experience to be able to, you know, have this professional level experience of curating artwork and helping set up a show of quality work, really professional work.
Well, thank you so much. I think that will close out the talk for David. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with us.